Member for Mallee can resume her seat. It being 2 p.m, the time for members' statements has concluded. Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. What is the cost of the Prime Minister's net zero by 2050 policy?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The plan we released today shows very clearly, Mr Speaker, that the
Members
cost of the
on my
low
left.
emissions and technology roadmap is $20 billion, Mr Speaker, over the next 10 years. In addition to that, $20 billion, Mr Speaker, is what we're investing in to produce those low emissions technologies, which is the central component of our plan to hit net zero emissions by 2050. It's technology, Mr Speaker, not taxes. Mr Speaker, it's about choices and mandates, not mandates, Mr Speaker. We're not seeking to force people to do things. We're not seeking to close anything down, Mr Speaker. They're the sorts of policies the Labor Party pursue. That's what their agenda is, Mr Speaker, not our side of politics. What we are doing is building up a portfolio of technologies which will ensure that over the next 30 years, Mr Speaker, we will be able to achieve that goal by adding to jobs, by adding to investment, by strengthening our regions, Mr Speaker, and rural communities, and our agricultural sectors, our transport sectors, our mineral sectors, our manufacturing sectors. Mr Speaker, under our government, Mr Speaker, we will be able to go to COP26 and say that our emissions reductions by 2030 will meet and beat our Paris commitments. 35%, Mr Speaker, up to 35% reduction is what we now anticipate because of the work that is being done, and particularly, Mr Speaker, because of the low emissions technology roadmap which has been brought together by the Minister for Industry, Energy and Emissions Reduction. Mr Speaker, this is a plan that backs in the efforts of Australians that Australians are making, Mr Speaker, that is already seeing us reduce emissions and sets us on that pathway to 2050 to ensure that we achieve net zero emissions, Mr Speaker, without damaging our economy, without taking away the way of life that rural and regional Australians have been able to appreciate it. When the Labor Party is in power, Mr Speaker, they only had one plan to reduce emissions. It was called a tax.
The member for Higgins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister outline to the House the Morrison government's plan to deliver net zero emissions by 2050 through practical and responsible action that also preserves jobs and creates new opportunities across Australia?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The member for Higgins knows and has been a champion of understanding, Mr Speaker, that Australians understand and support the need to take action on climate change. So do I, and so does my government, Mr Speaker. I know this because Australians are already taking action on climate change. Already, Mr Speaker, they're doing it. Australia's emissions have already fallen by more than 20% since 2005, and that's stronger than countries like the United States, like Canada, like New Zealand, Mr Speaker, like Japan. In fact, we have exceeded their emissions reductions over that period of time. And, Mr Speaker, we've done that at the same time as we've seen record levels of renewable investment and renewable energy coming into our system and ensuring, Mr Speaker, that we're setting up opportunities for the future exceeding many times over the global average. Some 8 times the global average when it comes to the installation of renewable energy, Mr Speaker, in Australia. And on top of that, Mr Speaker, we're meeting and beating the emissions reductions targets that we set. We took to the Australian people. They not only supported having a sensible and responsible target, but they also supported the fact that they knew we would seek to meet and beat those targets, which is exactly what we're doing, and we will expect to see a 35% reduction in emissions by 2030 based on the policies that we've been pursuing. Now, we're doing this while at the same time the economy, Mr Speaker, has grown by 45%. 3 million jobs have come into the Australian economy, Mr Speaker. We're growing our exports, including our minerals exports and our gas exports, and particularly in the LNG sector, Mr Speaker, creating so much wealth and jobs for this country. And we're doing it while we're putting Australians back into manufacturing jobs. Mr Speaker, there are 1 million Australians in manufacturing jobs. Under Labor, 1 in 8 manufacturing jobs were gone. They went, Mr Speaker. But we're reducing emissions, growing our economy, putting people back into manufacturing jobs, supporting their jobs in agriculture, supporting them in the resources sector, and that's what our plan does, Mr Speaker. Our detailed plan to achieve net zero target by 2050 is a uniquely Australian plan. It gets the balance right to ensure that we protect jobs, protect livelihoods, protect incomes, protect their way of life, Mr Speaker, keep downward pressure on their household costs to ensure we can get the balance right in the plans that are necessary. Mr Speaker, this is a uniquely Australian way to deal with this because we need a uniquely Australian solution to deal with our economy. Mr Speaker, the actions of Australia speak far louder than the words of many others who will speak from many other places. And Mr Speaker, we will not have our plans determined by any others than those who remain in this government, in this place, for Australians, by Australians, and that is the plan that we're going forward, which protects our economy and meets our commitments.
The Prime Minister's time has concluded. The member for McMahon.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question's to the Prime Minister. Yesterday, the government told Senate estimates it would claim public interest immunity to refuse to release the government's modelling on the impact of net zero by 2050. Today, the Prime Minister said his modelling will be released another time. How is it in the public interest to hide the impact of the government's net zero policy?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, there it is. There's the policy, Mr Speaker. It's been released. And it includes the results of the modelling in the plan, Mr Speaker. I tell you what, you won't
Prime
find on that side,
Prime Minister,
Mr.
just
Speaker.
resume your seat for a second. Prime Minister, just resume your seat for a second. At this point, it's inevitable I need to intervene for reasons. Members interjecting no. And I'm just going to point out, because I'm anticipating more interjections which I won't deal with, just so that everyone is clear, the provisions of Standing Order 94A do not require a warning. I've just been generous in doing that, probably too generous, and I'll have no hesitation in using it. The member for Isaacs, I'm not going to single out everyone interjecting. I'll detain you for some time. You're interjecting regularly and you're waving your arms around. Yeah, you are. And even though you've been moved away from here, which I welcome, as far as I'm concerned, it's not far enough in the manner that you're interjecting. The Prime Minister has the call. Well, you moved him, I didn't. I'm expressing...
Mr Speaker, the policy that has been adopted by the government was considered by Cabinet last night. And so that's why today, Mr Speaker, I was in a position to advise that today we are releasing the plan, the detailed plan, Mr Speaker, that sets out how we reach net zero emissions by 2050 by focusing on technology, not taxes, by ensuring that we're respecting people's choices and not seeking to mandate them and tell them how to live and what to buy and how they're supposed to do things on their farms and other places, Mr Speaker, to ensure we have a strong portfolio of technologies that can be successful over the next 30 years to achieve these targets, to get the balance right between affordability and emissions reduction, to keep prices down and to keep the lights on and ensure that there's the transparency and accountability, not just on emissions reduction, but ensuring that we're constantly monitoring the socio-economic impacts of these policies, particularly in rural and regional areas, Mr Speaker, and we're confident, absolutely confident, the plan that we have, the plan that we have agreed, Mr Speaker, the plan that we have adopted, that sets out our policies in detail as to how this is going to be achieved, will be a positive economic benefit, as the modelling indeed shows, Mr Speaker. Now, we will release that modelling as we indeed should, Mr Speaker, and we certainly will. Today we've released the plan, and we will soon release the modelling as well. But, Mr Speaker, that is very different to what happened at the last election. At the last election, there was a choice between a 2030 target of 26 to 28% by the government and a 45% target offered by the Labor Party. Now, the Labor Party was asked to release the costings and modelling that went to their policy. They refused to do it. Now, Mr Speaker, to be fair...
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker, I asked the Prime Minister to table the document that he's referring to.
I've said to the Leader of the Opposition, you can only do that at the conclusion of the answer.
Surely he's finished.
No, it's actually really straightforward. Yes. The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, so that modelling will be released. Of course it will be released. I've already said it would be, Mr Speaker, and it'll be there to demonstrate, Mr Speaker. But what I do know is that we won't see any modelling on the Labor Party policy because there isn't a policy. There isn't any modelling, just like there was no modelling on their 45% emissions reduction target, and they couldn't tell anyone what it cost because there was nothing in it. Mr Speaker, they have a target without a plan. Mr Speaker, they have a target without a cost. Mr Speaker, they have a blank cheque that they want to put into law and force it on Australians and mandate them to do things, Mr Speaker. That's what laws are supposed to do. That's not our plan. We're going to back Australians to achieve this goal. This target, we know they want to achieve it. We know they're already taking actions in their own lives, in their own households, in their own businesses, in their own industries, and they're moving forward, and we're going to back them to do it. The Labor Party thinks you have to make a law to force them to do it, Mr Speaker. That's not our approach. That's not our approach. That's their taxes approach.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Yes, Mr Speaker, I know that you will foresee this coming, but I would ask that the Prime Minister table the document that he's referring to.
Is leave granted?
No, Mr Speaker, I simply say that this is a public document.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
It's a public document, Mr Speaker.
No, I'll hear from the Leader of the Opposition again.
Yes, Mr Speaker, if it's a public document, then it should be available to the public, which is why it should be tabled.
Well, just saying, if the request is whether the Prime Minister will table it.
Australia's long-term emissions reduction plan, a whole-of-economy plan to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. I would invite at some future opportunity, as the standing orders allow, for the Leader of the Opposition to table his plan, Mr Speaker, for achieving the same thing. I'll be waiting a while. I've been waiting for 2 years.
The Prime Minister, you just need to table it, OK? The member for Flynn.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. Will the Deputy Prime Minister inform the House how the Morrison-Joyce government is not only delivering nationally significant infrastructure but local projects that will support our communities and regional economies? How will this benefit my state of Queensland? Is the Deputy Prime Minister aware of alternative policies?
The Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his question and once again reiterate his support of the mighty city of Gladstone and the people in the surrounding hinterland and the seat of Emerald. I once again reiterate his support of the near 750 vessels that leave the port of Gladstone every year. 750 vessels with the produce on board, whether that's coal, whether that's grain, that supports this great nation's standard of living, that underpins its health, its education, its defence, that brings in the export dollars, that maintains the value of our currency. So vital is the Port of Gladstone to where this nation goes, and I know the member for Flynn has been a great champion for that. And that is why, Mr Speaker, that we are building the infrastructure to further enhance the Port of Gladstone. The 1,716 kilometres of the inland rail, which now you could get an inland rail on from the train on from Parkes to Narromine. And today I just hear of another further 30 kilometres between Balladder to Moree. We're actually doing the job. We're getting the thing built. And it's not that. We've also started on the business plan to take it down further from Toowoomba to Gladstone. You always start major projects with a business plan, and we're doing precisely that. But, Mr Speaker, it's also the smaller roads, the roads that have been left behind by the Labor government up there, especially the Taroom to Bohemia Downs Road. We're asking ourselves, how do we go about these areas that have been left behind by Labor? Or the Mundubbera to Geelong Road, another road that's just been left behind by Labor. We have to really consider what on earth is going on there. But, Mr Speaker, it is also the case. The member asked for alternate policies, and I have to concur absolutely with the Prime Minister, because, see, the member for Flynn will want to know what our plan is. Yeah. It's inspiration. It's making sure we believe in liberties and freedoms. But there is an alternate plan. It's one of legislation. It's the only thing we know about their plan, legislation. And, Mr Speaker, legislation brings in laws, and laws outlaw things, and laws are enforced with penalties. Laws are enforced with penalties. So we do have a clear differentiation. In fact, we have a chasm between the two different policies, because we believe in inspiration and technology, and they believe in laws and penalties. We believe in inspiration, they believe in punishment. We believe in freedom, they believe in enforcement. We believe people can rise up to a higher level to deal with the problems. They believe that they will force them down with further laws, that they will further wrap up their lives in legislation. And that is a vast, vast difference between the processes. So I stand with this side, 100% with this side, believing in the freedom of the individual, and I will make sure that the laws that will put at threat your workers are never brought into place.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Isn't it the case that instead of delivering a climate change policy after almost a decade in government, today the Prime Minister presented a 15-page slideshow with no new policy?
The Prime Minister.
No.
We now have the independence question. I go to the member for Clark.
Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, the community has had a gutful of the lack of integrity in politics. Your government in particular has been beset with scandals, rorts and lies, and trust in politicians is at an all-time low. Of course, the crossbench has been leading the charge to fix this. For example, with members yesterday moving bills to establish an effective anti-corruption commission, bring honesty and transparency to political donations, and to clean up the filth in political advertising. Prime Minister, why aren't you responding to this concern? And in these last weeks of the 46th Parliament, will you actually do something tangible to restore public faith in the political process?
The Minister has the call.
The member for his question. The member for Clark, I know he has a long-standing interest in these issues and the question of integrity in politics, and of course it's an interest that the coalition government, the Morrison government, very strongly shares, and that is why we are proceeding with our commitment to establish a Commonwealth Integrity Commission designed to be the lead body in Australia's successful multi-agency anti-corruption framework and designed to enhance accountability across the public sector. We've been going through a national consultation process, some 330 written submissions received, 46 consultations. We're now carefully considering that feedback as a necessary step to finalising and introducing the legislation. But of course we're doing more than preparing the legislation, Mr Speaker. What we're also doing is providing very significant funding, indeed almost $150 million committed to the Commonwealth Integrity Commission, and at full capacity the Commission will have around 172 staff. Mr Speaker, I want to be clear that the Commonwealth Integrity Commission will have significant powers. It will be able to investigate past conduct and matters that occurred prior to its commencement, and it will be able to look into past conduct that falls into the scope of its jurisdiction, which includes some 145 criminal offences currently existing in legislation, for example, offences in the Criminal Code Act. And of course the government has also indicated that we intend to create new offences relating to criminal corrupt conduct, including concealing corruption and repeated public sector corruption. So, Mr Speaker, I say to the member for Clark, I say to the House, our government is working through, in a methodical and thorough fashion, a very comprehensive model here. And I say to the member, and indeed I say to the opposition, if you are ready to back us, then say so. Join us on this journey to get this legislation passed in a significant step to further introduce powerful measures to be able to uphold integrity and to deal with the threat of criminally corrupt conduct at the Commonwealth level.
The member for Stirling.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer inform the House about the Morrison government's ongoing commitment to keep taxes low for Australian businesses and families, helping generate more jobs in the regions and the cities right around the country? And is the Treasurer aware of any alternative policies?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Stirling for his question, acknowledge his background in the ADF, Mr Speaker, and in the private sector, and 60,000 people across the member for Stirling's electorate are getting a tax cut as a result of policies that we on this side of the House have supported. Now, Mr Speaker, we on this side of the House, Liberal and National parties, support more jobs and lower taxes. More jobs and lower taxes. When we came to government, unemployment was 5.7%. Today, it's 4.6%. An additional 1.4 million Australians are in jobs as a result of the policies of this side of the House, Mr Speaker. And we've lowered taxes, more than $300 billion of legislated tax cuts. Indeed, in the last 3 budgets, as a result of the tax relief that we have legislated through the parliament, if you're a person on $60,000 a year, take a bus driver, take a baker, Mr Speaker, you will pay $6,480 less tax as a result of the policies that we have passed through the parliament. And we're creating jobs right around the country with our 10-year infrastructure pipeline. Snowy Hydro, Snowy 2.0, more than 5,000 jobs being supported by that program. Western Sydney Airport, more than 11,000 jobs. And once it's up and running, 28,000 jobs, Mr Speaker. And then the Melbourne-Brisbane Inland Rail, more than 20,000 jobs across our regions as a result of that single infrastructure project. And I'm asked, are there any alternative policies, Mr Speaker, to our policies which are creating more jobs and driving down taxes? Well, we know the Leader of the Opposition, he has 2 big policy ideas. 2 big policy ideas. A national driver's licence to turbocharge the economy and a $6 billion conversation starter to pay people $300 if they've already had the jab, Mr Speaker. A policy that he asked us to support when his own shadow finance minister wouldn't support. But we also know that the member for Rankin is cooking up another policy, Mr Speaker. Surprise, surprise, it's higher taxes. It's a $27 billion hit on family businesses. Family businesses, 300,000 of them. And we're told on the front page of The Australian that Dr Chalmers, the member for Rankin, told his senior colleagues that this tax increase would, quote, leave room for spending measures. So those opposite will continue to spend more, those opposite will continue to tax more, while we on this side of the House are driving down taxes and creating more jobs.
The member for Richmond.
My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. How does he reconcile his earlier statement that the likelihood of the government adopting net zero is zero to his changed public answers this week supporting net zero for the regions? And does he agree with the member for Gippsland who said, I think Michael's removal from office was the greatest act of political treachery in our party in 100 years. I said at the time, and I believe that today, it was all about personal ambition. It wasn't a policy.
The first part of that question, the member for Barton, the first part of that question is in order. The latter part, 2/3 of it, relating to the former Deputy Prime Minister, is out of order. The Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, I'm only too happy to answer the honourable member's question because within the Coalition and within the Nationals we diligently went through the process, as we've always said, to make sure that it was something that was that looked after people in regional areas. Sort of regional areas, the regional areas where I hope that you would clearly understand them. And one of the big things we were looking for, Mr Speaker, when we did that, because it was incredibly important that we checked for it and went through it, we wanted to make absolutely certain that there was no legislation in there that enforced things, because we don't believe in penalties. They believe in penalties. They believe that the state reigns supreme over the individual. We believe that the individual rises above the state. They believe in penalties and enforcements, and you're part of that. They believe in legislation. Legislation brings in laws. Laws are enforced by penalties. And those laws and penalties put coal workers at threat,
put meat workers at threat, put the people in the Hunter Valley at threat, put the people of Central Queensland at threat. It's legislation that they're looking out for, and we were making sure that the people of Central Queensland are safe, that the people of the Hunter Valley are safe, and we diligently went through that process, Mr Speaker. We went through that process so that we could go forward with a plan that stands for the people of business. We believe in the inspiration of the individual and the smarts of the individual to rise above the enforcements of the Labor Party, the red tape of the Labor Party, all the obstructions of the Labor Party, and finally the unemployment of the Labor Party.
The member for O'Connor.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health and Aged Care. Will the Minister please update the House on Australia's vaccine rollout and how it's providing protection for all, including older Australians?
The Minister for Health and Aged Care.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for O'Connor for his work for people right across his electorate, including towns such as Kojonup, which has a 90% vaccination rate, and which was also able to establish a first-class medical centre with his support, with the support of the community and with the matching support of the Community Health and Hospitals program. Kojonup, of course, is an example of one of the thousands of towns and communities around Australia that have continued to have been vaccinated at record levels. We've now reached 87.1% of the country with a first dose and 74.1% of the country that has had a second dose. And we do this knowing that the pandemic continues around the world, with over 414,000 cases in the last 24 hours, with over 6,600 lives lost in the last 24 hours. These are numbers that are profound and significant, and we need to focus on those human impacts. And that's why what we have done in this country, with the small towns and the suburbs, with the communities and the cities coming together, has been a great Australian achievement and story. One of the most important parts of that is what we've been able to do in protecting our older Australians. We've now achieved, for our over 50s, 94.5% of first doses. For our over 60s, 96.5%, and extraordinarily, and as one of our great national achievements, for our most vulnerable Australians, for our over 70s, in terms of the coronavirus pandemic and the risks that they face, a 98.5% first dose vaccination rate. That is a rate which around the world stands with the absolute highest and finest. And most importantly, it protects those Australians who are most at risk. And that is backed within our aged care facilities, a 99.8% vaccination rate for our aged care workers. There were those that may have doubted this, but we didn't doubt, we delivered. And that's significant. That's the pattern, the hallmark, the nature, the scope of what this government does under this Prime Minister. And so we've been able to achieve those outcomes, and now the next thing is, over the coming days, we'll receive, and I expect to receive, the final advice of the TGA and ATAGI on the booster program, and we'll begin again with our older Australians, and we're ready to support those in residential aged care and then the general population. And so as we go forward, we're continuing to save lives and protect lives.
The member for Ballarat.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. Net zero is a commitment that's meant to last for 30 years. Yesterday, Senator Canavan said the government would scrap its net zero policy after the election because we can't bind future party rooms or parliaments. Why should anyone believe this slideshow will last beyond the next election if the coalition is re-elected?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for a question, and might I say that as much as I have a lot of time at times for Senator Canavan, he didn't actually write the plan. And so, Mr Speaker, the views of any individual is I'm glad that the honourable member is fascinated, and I must say, she seems to be following Senator Canavan a lot closer than I am. But it's good. She has a lot of spare time. They get a lot of spare time on the other side. And Mr. Speaker, I think the really important thing is that she obviously has a strong belief that for the next 30 years we'll be in government, and I appreciate that. I appreciate that. And on their recent track record, it wouldn't be surprising. And I'll tell you why, Mr. Speaker, that she thinks we'll be looking after this nation for the next 30 years is because we believe in the inspiration of the individual, and her government believes in legislation. They are going to legislate. They're going to legislate, and by so doing, see, the member for Sydney, she doesn't care about Central Queensland. She thinks that Central Queensland's a big joke. It's a big joke. Well, maybe if they had $500 million for an art gallery in Central Queensland, life would be a lot better for them. But the member for Sydney thinks that Central Queensland is a joke. She must
just
think
so the
those
Deputy
blue-collar
Prime Minister,
workers are a joke.
you're digressing from the question.
Sorry, Mr. Speaker, I was distracted by the frivolity of the member for Sydney, who was obviously thought that people's lives and working.
No, you're now repeating it,
Mr. Speaker. We will make sure. In response to the question, that for the next 30 years, if we are blessed with the opportunity of running the place, and I hope we are, for the sake of Australians, that we will utilise a mechanism of believing in the intelligence of people and the inspiration of people to achieve the outcomes that we have set out in the plan, because it's only the other side that believes in legislating them out of a job.
The member for Wentworth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Industry, Energy and Emissions Reduction. Will the Minister outline to the House how the Morrison government's plan will see Australia build on our record of meeting and beating our emissions reduction targets, focusing on technology, not taxes? And is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Industry, Energy and Emissions Reduction.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for Wentworth for his question, and as a well-respected former diplomat. He knows how important it is to have a strong plan to reach net zero by 2050, but to do it in the Australian way, Mr. Speaker, to do it in the Australian way. And he knows that we're building on a strong track record.
The member
Mr.
for
Speaker.
Macarthur will leave under Standing Order 94A. The Minister has the call.
He knows we have a strong track record, Mr. Speaker. We met and beat our Kyoto targets by 459 million tonnes, almost a year's worth of emissions. We're on track to meet and beat our 2030 targets by up to 35% reduction, Mr. Speaker. We're already 20.8% down, Mr. Speaker. And the plan we've laid out today is a practical, responsible path forward, Mr. Speaker, that respects Australians and respects the Australian way, Mr. Speaker, preserving and supporting jobs in traditional industries, but also capturing new opportunities as they emerge and as customer demands change, Mr. Speaker. It continues to build on the policies and initiatives that have worked, Mr. Speaker, that have worked. Now, there's 5 core principles behind the plan. Technology, not taxes, Mr. Speaker. The plan respects Australians' choices. It respects the fact that Australians have been choosing to put solar on their roofs. 1 in 4 Australians, Mr. Speaker, not being told by the government, doing it because it's their choice. It respects the enormous importance of affordable, reliable energy for our regions and for Australia more generally, Mr. Speaker. It supports our export industries and the strength that they've provided this great nation and will provide for many, many years to come, Mr. Speaker. And it doesn't impose costs on Australians through a portfolio of technologies coming down to parity, to cost competitiveness with the higher emitting alternatives, like ultra-low-cost solar, Mr. Speaker, that we've just introduced into the low emissions technology statement. We're targeting $15 a megawatt hour. Clean aluminium, clean steel, clean hydrogen at under $2 per kilogram, getting the cost of measuring soil carbon, that great carbon sink, 90 million hectare carbon sink in Australian agriculture, Mr. Speaker, getting the cost of measuring that down to a metre, Mr. Speaker, down to $3 per hectare per year. But there's an alternative, Mr. Speaker. There's an alternative. We've laid out our plan for 2030, for 2050. Those opposite haven't, Mr. Speaker. No target for 2030, no plan for 2030, No plan for 2050. The only thing they've got, Mr Speaker, all they seem to have up their sleeve is a law. Mr Speaker, telling Australians what to do. Indeed, the Leader of the Opposition called a technology-led approach absurd, Mr Speaker. But we know what they really want to do, Mr Speaker. They want to impose taxes because that's the only tool in their toolkit.
The member for Whitlam.
To the Deputy Prime Minister, and I refer to his statement that these people actually did read the Productivity Commission reports. I use them when I run out of toilet paper. Given this statement, why is the Deputy Prime Minister delivering the regions another Productivity Commission report?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
I tell you what, Mr Speaker, I admire his history lesson. That was more than 10 years ago. So, you know, obviously they've got a lot of spare time on the other side. They have a lot of spare time. They're going through people's tweets. They're reading back, I don't know, maybe they're spending time on Odgers, reading the process of the Senate. But it's remarkable that you've reached back that far in time. But I must say, I'm kind of flattered. I'm a little bit flattered that they're so interested in me. You know, I came in here feeling a little bit down the dumps at stage, but you know, he really perks me up. He's a good fella. I can send him some of my photo albums. He can start having a little look through those. But, Mr Speaker, I think what's really important is there's consistency between what happened back then and what happened now. And that is this, that right back then I believed in the liberty of the individual. I believed that the state was there to serve the individual. And right back then I believe that you probably had the same position, that you believed the state was your master. And that's why the Labor Party believes... Why are you so upset about me telling you about your policy,
The Deputy Prime
mate?
Minister will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
The question went to Productivity Commission reports, which the Deputy Prime Minister says is a part of what the National Party has got from the government.
We don't need to sort of go into an explanation.
He's not talking anything about whether Productivity Commission reports are worthwhile.
I asked the Leader of the Opposition to resume his seat. The Deputy Prime Minister will bring himself back to the question.
I'm happy to do that because we are making absolutely certain in the reports that come back that we are looking after regional people. We are making absolutely certain that we've got the checks and balances that oversee this in such a way that we can maintain the coal jobs, as if they're affected by international circumstances, so be it. But we are not going to affect them with domestic regulations, which the Labor Party are proposing regulations, Mr Speaker, and of course every worker wants to know whether regulations affect them.
No, I just say to the Deputy Prime Minister that the question was about Productivity Commission reports, and he needs to confine himself to that.
Mr Speaker, the reason we are reporting back is we want the proper checks and balances because we respect our people.
The member for Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Minister for Industry, Energy and Emissions Reduction. Will the Minister update the House on how the Morrison government's plan to reduce emissions will protect jobs and generate new opportunities for industry? And is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Industry, Energy and Emissions Reduction.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Robertson for her question. And she is a great advocate of manufacturing on the Central Coast, and she knows how important it is that we bring down emissions while strengthening our manufacturing sector, Mr Speaker. Businesses like Borg, Sanitarium, McCain and Master Foods in her electorate and on the Central Coast, Mr Speaker. And that's what our plan for net zero emissions by 2050 does, Mr Speaker. It supports our traditional industries. It supports manufacturing, Mr Speaker. It makes sure that we support those traditional industries but also capture the new economic opportunities that are emerging because customers' demands are changing. And with it, Mr Speaker, we need to deploy the technologies, shape those technologies to ensure that our manufacturers are able to provide their customers with what they want. Now, more than 1 million Australians are now working in manufacturing, Mr Speaker. Substantially more than before, 80,000 more than before the pandemic, Mr Speaker. And in fact, the last time we saw a slashing of jobs in manufacturing when those opposite were in government, Mr Speaker. 1 in 8. And I'll come back to that, Mr Speaker. But this plan is the right plan. Our plan is the right plan for Australia because it does focus on the technologies that matter for our manufacturers: clean steel, clean aluminium, hydrogen, Mr Speaker, carbon capture and storage. Essential technologies which those opposite vote against regularly, Mr Speaker. 7 times they've done it. 7 times they've done it. It focuses on supporting our farmers who provide the food for our food manufacturers, Mr Speaker. Our manufacturers are well positioned to use our unique industrial advantages, combining innovation, material resources, abundant clean energy and our skilled workforce, Mr Speaker. But I am asked about alternatives. Now, we understand that there's a choice here. There's a choice between, on the one hand, technology and, on the other hand, taxes. Now, the last time, Mr Speaker, those opposite were in government, they imposed a tax, a carbon tax on all Australian manufacturing, on all Australians indeed, Mr Speaker, and we saw 1 in 8 jobs in manufacturing lost when they were in government, Mr Speaker, at places like Kurri Kurri, where we saw the aluminium smelter shutting after the introduction of the carbon tax, Mr Speaker. It's only now we're establishing a new business there, jobs in a gas generator at Kurri Kurri, supporting affordable, reliable energy, that great strength of the Hunter Valley region, Mr Speaker. Those opposite don't even have targets, let alone a plan when it comes to 2030, Mr Speaker. The only plan that Labor knows is how to destroy jobs, how to destroy manufacturing in this country. We understand the need for a strong economic plan to reduce emissions and provide jobs for all Australians.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister, and I refer to his previous answers, such that they were. How can Australians trust this government to deliver on net zero by 2050 when you will be acting Prime Minister in 2 days and you are opposed to it?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, today's Tuesday, isn't it? Wednesday, Thursday, so it's Friday. It's actually Friday. It'll be Thursday evening that the Prime Minister leaves. And Mr Speaker, no one's suggesting that we're going to get there by the end of the week. No one's suggesting that. And of course, by the way, Mr Speaker, the biggest thing, of course, is that people clearly understand that in our roles, my role as Leader of the Nationals, I'm making absolutely certain that we don't legislate the coal miners out of a job.
The member for Mallee.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Agriculture and Northern Australia. Will the Minister inform the House how the Morrison-Joyce government is supporting the agriculture industry through the Technology Investment Roadmap and ensuring that there is an environment in place to protect our agriculture industry, reduce emissions, keep jobs and create new jobs?
The member for Perth can leave understanding Order 94A. And the Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Mallee for her question and her commitment to Australian agriculture. And the federal government made a further commitment to Australian agriculture today in not only helping it reduce its emissions but increase its productivity. Since 2005, the Australian agricultural and land sector have reduced their emissions by over 55%, but have in fact over doubled their production over that period while doing it. A significant achievement in a partnership between the federal government and the agricultural sector in the science and technology to increase productivity, profitability and reducing emissions. And we're complementing that further with the technology roadmap, with our stewardship program. We are the first country in the world to be able to measure biodiversity. And so we are adding to the carbon farming model that has been put out there to support those farmers to not only get carbon abate, but also to get a payment through a voluntary market for the improvement in biodiversity, a measurement that the world now sees as the intellectual property that this country owns because of the investment that the agricultural sector and the federal government has made, a $66 million investment through our stewardship program. But we're also making sure that they can market their product with a brand of seal, their beef, their sheep, with a sustainability brand that says that this has been produced in the most sustainable way, improving the biodiversity, abating carbon, a world first. And that's not about taking away productive landscape, but rejuvenating those parts of the landscape that is costing farmers money, just using common sense. We're also working with our innovation partners like Meat and Livestock Australia. The red meat sector has reduced their emissions by 53% since 2005, and they're planning to double the output of red meat profitability over the next decade while reducing to a net zero emissions target. And they're doing that with the science of feed supplements that go to seaweed and legumes that will reduce methane emissions, also around the genetics that reduce it as well, and then also around soil carbon. We've made a $200 million investment through our National Soil Strategy to be able to measure soil carbon more accurately, and the Energy Minister's also announced a $36 million science challenge to have the best and brightest in the world, right here in Australia, be able to get a credible test for under $3 a hectare. The over 90 million hectares of Australian agricultural landscape can play a part in abating carbon while increasing productivity, supporting the over 330,000 Australians in agriculture, building on their jobs, building the productivity and the profitability of those farms, while playing a significant part in reducing our emissions, living up to our international commitments. This technology roadmap is not just about a more sustainable agricultural sector, it's also about a more profitable one.
The member for Brand.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Resources. Yesterday, the member for Mallee said about solar panels, they don't work in the dark and neither do our wind farms. Does the Minister agree?
The Minister has the call.
Well, thank you for the call, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the honourable member for their question? The member for Mallee is right. There are wind turbines when there is no wind of a night time. They don't work. They don't work during the day when there is no wind.
Members on my
that
left.
is the nature of intermittent generation, Mr Speaker. That is just the reality of life.
The member for Parkes has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is also to the Minister for Resources and Water. Will the Minister inform the House how the Morrison-Joyce government is positioning Australia as a leading supplier of critical minerals and rare earth elements to meet the growing global demand for the new energy technologies required in a modern economy, and what will this mean for the communities in the Parkes electorate? Is the Minister aware of any alternative policies?
The Minister for Resources and Water has the call.
Well, can I thank the honourable member for their question, Mr Speaker? And the honourable member's got the opportunity at the moment. The sun is shining down on the honourable member's electorate. They're in a really good position in terms of agriculture. It looks like a record crop, a lot of water in the dams and infrastructure, Mr Speaker. But in terms of critical minerals, Mr Speaker, and as the honourable member knows, there are significant resources in his area, and that includes, we've seen the company ASM sign a $250 million framework agreement with the South Korean consortium, and that is going to look like a significant investment, Mr Speaker. And also, Mr Speaker, this government has announced a $2 billion critical minerals infrastructure loan facility that will help us to drive some of these projects forward, will help us to ensure that critical minerals continue to grow, continue to build the Australian economy and continue to provide jobs for Australians. Now, Mr Speaker, why is that important? Well, if we look at what's happening around the world right now, we know that the European Industry Association issued a statement on the 22nd of October 21, and that statement said they expect that the shortage in global magnesium could halt their operations in the next few weeks across Europe. Now, the reason for that is that 90% approximately of the magnesium global output comes from China. We know, Mr Speaker, that in Australia we hold enough of this resource to potentially support that global demand for more than 100 years. So right across the critical mineral spectrum, we want to see Australian resources in these products. We want to see Australian resources into things like batteries. And I know those opposite have got a lot of questions for me around batteries, Mr Speaker, but we have some of the largest recoverable reserves of critical minerals in the world. In fact, the 9 most advanced critical mineral projects in Australia alone have the potential to add more than 7,000 jobs and unlock $8 billion worth of investment. Now, Mr Speaker, if we add that on to the $349 billion forecast for resources already, the 260,000 plus Australians already employed, this is a good outcome for our country. Now, we are looking to ensure that we can fill these markets where there is demand. We want to ensure that that demand is filled by Australian companies, by Australian resources that are delivered by Australian workers. And, Mr Speaker, those opportunities will come because of the support from the Commonwealth, the fact that we outline our plans, that we deliver absolutely a $2 billion loan facility and other levels of support, Mr Speaker, because quite simply this is good for our country, it's good for our economy, it's good for opportunities, particularly in regional Australia, like the member for Parkes electorate, like the member for Flynn's electorate, like many regional electorates right around the country, Mr Speaker. Now, we expect to see a lot of these jobs delivered over coming years. We want to make sure that we fill as many as possible downstream from minerals to metals. That is why we're supporting the sector. And in the last few seconds, Mr Speaker, while I've got the opportunity, I'm asked about alternatives. We know that those opposite continue to talk down the resources sector and Australia. We stand up for our sector. We support the resources sector. We want to see more jobs, not less. Shame on those opposite.
Member for McNamara.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Given the Prime Minister now supports Labor's policy on net zero, will he also support Labor's policy for an electric car discount, which will make electric cars cheaper for Australian families?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Speaker, I don't support Labor's policy, Mr Speaker. They don't have one. There's nothing to support, Mr Speaker. They've got a target, but they've got no plan, Mr Speaker. The only things we can discern from their policies, Mr Speaker, is what they did last time they were in government, which is they taxed people. They sought to tax people, they sought to mandate things, they sought to force them to do things, Mr Speaker. And so, no, I won't be supporting the Labor Party's policy, Mr Speaker, because not only do I know what it is, the Australian people don't know what it is. They don't know what their target is, Mr Speaker.
The Prime Minister resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker, on relevance, it was a very specific question about Labor's electric vehicle
just say to the Leader of the
discount.
Opposition, you need to resume your seat, and I'm going to go back to where I did yesterday and be very... The Minister for... Yes, it's okay. I'll just stop right there. I'm going to be very clear about this. It was not a specific question about electric cars. If that's all that was asked, you would have a valid point of order. But when you have a tagline on that's about support for Labor's policies, it opens the question right up. Yeah, that's right. I mean, I've got to look. I don't want to have an argument. I've got a copy of it in front of me. I don't want to read the question again, given you now support Labor's policy on net zero. The Prime Minister is entitled to respond to that. If you don't want him to do that, don't put it in the question and just ask a specific question about electric vehicles. You didn't ask that. The Prime Minister has the call. He's completely in order.
So our policies are very clear about what we're seeking to do. We've set them out in a 130-page document or thereabouts, Mr Speaker, which I was happy to table earlier during question time, Mr Speaker. But I'm not surprised that the Labor Party doesn't support our policy, because you won't find any taxes in it. You won't find anything in there telling people what they have to do and what they're mandating. You won't find in there anyone banning anything, anyone trying to shut down any mines or tell farmers what to do on their land. Mr Speaker, you won't find any additional regulation in our policy. That's why Labor doesn't like it. You won't find any more red tape. You won't find anyone, Mr Speaker, in there trying to get into people's lives and intervene in how they run their businesses, Mr Speaker. You won't find anything in this document, Mr Speaker, which is seeking to punish rural and regional Australia, which was what would happen under the Labor Party, Mr Speaker. And you won't find in our policies contracting out the decisions that should be made about Australians, about the Australian way that will achieve these targets, to those overseas, Mr Speaker, because that's what the Labor Party does. Under our policy, Mr Speaker, we've got an Australian way to hit net zero emissions by 2050 that is based on technology, not taxes, Mr Speaker, that is based on choices, not mandates on the Australian people, binding them legislation. And it was up again, Mr Speaker. He's been very lippy today. Mr Speaker,
Prime Minister, you can just answer the question.
It's also based on having a
you don't have to
portfolio of
comment on people
technologies that
moving
gets
around
the
the
job
chamber.
done. It's based on getting the right balance between affordability of our energy, Mr Speaker, and the reliability of energy, so we keep the lights on and we get the prices down. And, Mr Speaker, it's based on the transparency and accountability, not just on emissions and the transparency of getting emissions down, but ensuring that our policies demonstrate the economic gains and the socio-economic gains for all Australians, but particularly in rural and regional areas. I'm not surprised the Labor Party doesn't support our plan. They don't have a plan, Mr Speaker. They don't have a target for 2030. They don't like it because it hasn't got taxes in it, because that's the way Labor does things.
The member for Leichhardt.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Minister for the Environment. Will the Minister outline to the House the Morrison government's commitment to the long-term health and sustainability of the Great Barrier Reef?
The Minister for the Environment has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I'm delighted to take a question from the dynamic and determined reef envoy, the member for Leichhardt. The Morrison government is deeply committed to protecting the World Heritage-listed Great Barrier Reef, and we have the best managed reef in the world, something that has been demonstrated time and time again. Mr Speaker, the reef is big enough to see from outer space and one of the 7 natural wonders of the world. But we see the reef through the eyes of its communities, on the ground, up and down 2,300 kilometres of coastline and 400,000 square kilometres of catchment, with 64,000 jobs depending on it. From the farmers whose land management practices link with water quality, the recreational fishers, the Indigenous rangers spearing crown-of-thorns starfish, the citizen scientists, the tourism operators, the small businesses, the many Australians who live between Fraser Island and the Torres Strait. We are with the reef for the long haul, and we have backed the Reef 2050 management plan with over $2 billion of investment. And the success of that plan is acknowledged by many, including the World Heritage Centre, which in this year's World Heritage Committee meeting commended Australia for our strong and continued efforts, including through unprecedented financial commitments. We continue to make our reef the most healthy and resilient it can be in the face of the global challenge of climate change. We're not about heavy-handed regulation. Our reef communities are our champions and our partners, like the Destro family, cane growers in far north Queensland, who manage around 2,000 hectares of cane and who partnered with us on one of our water quality projects. Now the Destros are considered at the cutting edge of best cane farming practices, with Mrs Destro saying that there's not only less runoff leaving the farm, there's more profitability as well. Like our partnership with Turtle Care Volunteers Queensland on the Wreck Rock Turtle Project, the goal of which is to increase the number of turtle hatchlings on the stretch of coastline between Agnes Water and Bundaberg. Nev McLaughlin, who along with his wife Bev has been leading this monitoring program for 40 years, said, "We want to contribute to ensure that future generations of turtles will be nesting at Wreck Rock for all future generations of our families to appreciate." Like the scientists and the tourism industry coming together to deliver local reef restoration, trialling coral nurseries to propagate corals and then plant them on areas of the reef to accelerate recovery. Like the Indigenous women leading work on sea country, looking after waterways, looking after seagrass habitats and wildlife. Mr Speaker, we carry Australia's pride in the reef. We guard against those who would be cavalier with its reputation. And we are optimistic about the future of the reef and the communities and the jobs which depend on it.
The member for Chifley.
My question is to the Minister for Industry. Can the Minister confirm in October last year, Industry Minister number 6 said we'd establish mRNA manufacturing capability within the year, and then in May this year, Industry Minister number 7 said you're looking at a 12-month plus time frame, and now we have Industry Minister number 8 saying we're looking at 2 years but can't be sure. When are you going to stop making and remaking announcements and actually deliver locally manufactured mRNA vaccines in Australia?
The Minister for Industry has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. Thank you, Mr Speaker. And it's important to note that we have manufactured 23 million vaccines in this country, Mr Speaker, 23 million vaccines, and we have more than 1 million people working in manufacturing in this country. Now, Mr Speaker, those opposite got rid of 1 in 8 jobs in manufacturing when they were in government, but, Mr Speaker, they love to twist and distort the truth. They love to twist and distort the truth. And, of course, the member opposite talked about Minister Andrews, who said at the time that any time frame would depend on a range of factors. That's what she said, Mr Speaker, and that includes whether it's a brownfield site or a greenfield site, or whether we need access to R&D and intellectual property as part of it. Now, Mr Speaker, as we recover from COVID-19, we want to make sure that we are well placed to control our destiny. Mr Speaker, we are well placed to control our destiny, and in an uncertain world, that means that it's more important than ever to have sovereign manufacturing capability. And that's why we are developing a pathway to onshore manufacturing, not just of the vaccines that we've already manufactured, Mr Speaker, but more broadly for mRNA capability, mRNA vaccines. Now, there's two benefits from this, Mr Speaker. On the health side, of course, if we're struck with another pandemic, whether it's COVID or indeed flu pandemics, we'll be well positioned to speedily provide that mRNA support, Mr Speaker. But there is an economic and industry opportunity here too. And we support manufacturing in this country. We support industry in this country. That means they need to have access to the affordable, reliable energy they need. That's why we're back to over 1 million jobs in manufacturing, Mr Speaker. But we do want to see new areas of technology like mRNA developing here in Australia. And that's why, Mr Speaker, we're pursuing a two-part process. We're having discussions with Moderna. Mr Speaker. Now, I should point out there's only two companies in the world that have developed and are selling mRNA vaccines right now. Moderna is one of them. No new mRNA manufacturing, end-to-end manufacturing facility has been built in the world since COVID struck, Mr Speaker. Indeed, one is planned for Singapore several years away, so it's, we don't know when that's actually going to arrive. But we are having important discussions with Moderna, and there is great potential in that. But we are also, Mr Speaker, have gone through an approach to market. We've received a number of submissions in that. We're working those through, and we'll have something more to say about that in the coming days and weeks. But the one thing Australians can be sure of, Mr Speaker, is we back manufacturing in this country. We back manufacturing in this country every day of the week.
The member for Lindsay.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Employment, Workforce, Skills, Small and Family Business. Will the Minister update the House on how the Morrison government is protecting jobs and keeping Australians in training today to secure our future workforce? Is the Minister aware of alternative policies?
The Minister for Employment.
Let me thank the member for her question and all the work she's doing out there in the western suburbs of Sydney to ensure employment is being maximised. The Morrison government is backing in the next generation of Australian workers through our economic plan, guaranteeing pathways to skills and training through a record $6.4 billion this financial year. It builds on $5.9 billion last financial year. Our economic plan is about protecting jobs, connecting people with jobs and securing our future jobs. Our highly successful Job Chainer program has supported over 255,000 Australians enrolled in in-demand skills, and the $1 billion expansion we saw in the budget sees an additional 163,000 training places, including 10,000 in digital skills and 33,800 in aged care. Our supporting apprenticeships and trainee wage subsidy provide a $1.9 billion to over 74,000 employers to support their trainees and apprentices during all of the last 18 months. Our $3.9 billion boosting apprenticeship commencement program, 77,900 employers, employing over 220,000 new apprentices and trainees, and of course guaranteed funding through to the states and territories at over $1.5 billion, increasing year after year to guarantee TAFE funding. Mr Speaker, as a result of the input of the Morrison government, we've seen an increase of 140% of apprentice starts year on year. There are more apprentices in trades today than there were before the coalition came to government. It is an extraordinary achievement by this government. And we aren't finished yet. There's still a lot more to go, and we want to make sure every Australian out there has the opportunity for a job. That's why I can confirm today the Morrison government has delivered on our commitment to roll out a national network of 10 industry training hubs across Australia. Promises made, the Morrison government promises kept. The final industry training hub has been operating in Alice Springs in some weeks, Mr Speaker, the member for Lingiari's electorate. I'm sure he's pleased to see that. This completes the rollout of 10 industry training hubs: Alice Springs, Burnie, Townsville, Maryborough, Port Pirie, Shepparton, Armidale, Gosford, Wanneroo and Grafton. And I know the residents of Braddon and Tassie's Northwest value the industry training hub, as do the good people of Robinson. The Morrison government is keeping faith with Australian workers. More apprentices in trades than when we came into government, keeping our election commitments. And I'm asked, Mr Speaker, about alternative policies in this space. I can report to the House there are none. It's all pretty grim over there.
The Leader of the Opposition has the floor.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. This month, every state and territory wrote to the government requesting support to ensure their hospital systems can withstand increased pressure from COVID. Is the Prime Minister confident the health and hospital system can withstand increased COVID cases? Why isn't the Prime Minister listening to the states and territories which have led Australia through this crisis?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Commonwealth Government specifically has supported the states and territories, especially with their COVID-related health and hospital costs, through a 50-50 funding partnership, which has resulted, from memory, and I look to the Minister for Health, for about $6 billion. $6 billion of additional funds being provided to the states and territories. Now, this is on top of the National Health and Reform Agreement process, which has increased our funding to hospitals right across states and territories at multiple times the increases that states themselves. And if the states had actually maintained the pace of the increase in funding from the Commonwealth in their own state budgets, Mr Speaker, then there would be even further resources available in the hospital budgets at state and territory level. This issue has been a constant item on the agenda when I have met with the premiers and chief ministers on their hospital system readiness. It has been the subject of detailed modelling work done by both the Doherty Institute and by individual state and territories in terms of drawing on their own private modelling work, Mr Speaker, which has been informing the decisions they've been making and how they manage the crisis. And I particularly pay credit to both the New South Wales and Victorian governments, Mr Speaker, who are confronting the biggest of those challenges at that scale, and how they have been responding to those issues, Mr Speaker, because they have had the biggest surge in cases, and they are doing, Mr Speaker, an outstanding job. I think they are doing an outstanding job. Now, there are other states and territories, Mr Speaker, who haven't seen any of that COVID pressure. They haven't had the cases, Mr Speaker. They've tended to be the states who have been making a bit more noise, but they're yet to see the presentation of the challenges that have been faced in the New South Wales and Victorian system. And what I take from that, Mr Speaker, is there is a difference between the states and territories about how they're managing their hospital systems. Our funding is at record levels and increasing, Mr Speaker, at rapid rates. But at the same time, states and territories must run their hospitals and their health systems, and they must run them well. And, Mr Speaker, that is what we've been working with the states and territories, who actually had a specific dedicated team within the Department of Health working to Professor Murphy to ensure that we are closely monitoring the impact on the hospital and health systems. And as I said, we've been providing additional funding, particularly during the course of COVID. Overall, when you include the work we've done on vaccines, on the GP respiratory clinics and the mental health increase in support that we've provided through the states and territories, Mr Speaker, we're at around about $30 billion in additional investments we've put into health, into hospitals, to ensure that Australia comes through this crisis. Now, there won't be time for the Minister for Health to add to this answer, but I know this, Mr Speaker. Under the policies of our government, working together with the states and territories, we have one of the lowest fatality rates in the world for COVID. We have one of the strongest economies to come through COVID, Mr Speaker, and we are fast approaching the highest vaccination rates in the world, Mr Speaker, and indeed on a first dose vaccination will pass the UK.
The member for Reid.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Communications, Urban Infrastructure, Cities and the Arts, who is representing the Attorney-General. Will the Minister please inform the House how the Morrison government's landmark privacy reforms will help better protect Australians online?
The Minister for Communications.
Well, I do thank the member for Reid for her question and, of course, for her long-standing interest in the subject of how we keep Australians safe online, drawing as she does on her deep professional and academic experience as a psychologist. And, Mr Speaker, our government does have a very strong agenda when it comes to keeping Australians safe online. And just this week, the Attorney-General has released exposure draft of legislation which will further extend our comprehensive approach to keeping Australians safe online, particularly giving Australians confidence that when they're using digital platforms, that their personal information is appropriately protected. And so the exposure draft of legislation that we have released will increase penalties for serious and repeated breaches of privacy online, and very importantly, requires the creation of a binding online privacy code for social media services, data brokers and other large online platforms. The intention here, Mr Speaker, is to address the clear power imbalance between online platforms on the one hand and their users on the other, by giving Australians more control, more transparency about how their personal information is being handled. And in particular, the Online Privacy Code will strengthen protections for children and other groups of vulnerable users. We are being very clear in our requirements on the social media platforms under the code. They will be required to take all reasonable steps to verify the age of users, to take all reasonable steps to verify parental or guardian consent for children under the age of 16 years, and to require that the handling of children's personal information on their platforms is fair and reasonable, with the best interests of the child being the primary consideration. Now, Mr Speaker, we welcome feedback on this exposure draft, but we're getting on with the job across a whole range of areas when it comes to keeping Australians safe online and when it comes to protecting the privacy of Australians, both adults and children online. These are amongst the many areas that the prevalence of the internet presents, and I do want to acknowledge both the work of the Attorney-General and of the Assistant Minister of the Prime Minister for Mental Health in this important work.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice.